Zoom. The recording has started, so thank you, Sue Ann. I'm not going to use a microphone in here today. And one of the truths about me is I never know how loud I am. If I take my hearing aids out, I have no idea how loud anything is. If I have my hearing aids in, I have no idea how loud I am, because I always sound like I'm screaming to myself. And I don't want to be that guy. So typically people say I err on the side of not talking loud enough. If at any point you can't hear me, just cup your ear for a second, the universal sign that Mark needs to speak up a little bit. And having issued that sign so many times in my life, I know exactly what that means and how frustrating it is not to be able to hear. Okay, so today we're going to start with verses 18 through 20. And I have to kind of discipline my mind a little bit. I'm leaving town tomorrow. Chris and I are going to go visit some family and our granddaughter. And so I had to take next Monday's session yesterday. And it's hard for me to kind of remember which section I'm on when I'm thinking, you know, so I'm going to try to stay in verses 18 through 20 today. We'll start out reading it, and then I'll ask if you had any questions from the video that most of you were able to watch before coming. Luke chapter 1, starting with verse 18. You'll remember that the angel has just told Zechariah that his wife Elizabeth is going to have a child. We got some handouts on this table right here. Zechariah said to the angel, "How will I know that this is so? For I am an old man, and my wife is getting on in years." The angel replied, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. But now, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time, you will become mute, unable to speak, until the day these things occur." All right, that ends the reading. So first of all, let me just ask you, did you have any questions from the video? And those of you watching online, I'm going to ask you to do two things. Feel free to type any questions you have in the chat box, because we have some folks back there monitoring that. I'm also going to ask you to mute your screen as well as your sound. We are getting some folks that feel like all the commotion on some of the screens is a little distracting. So if you don't mind muting your screens, your video and your sound, that would be great. And any questions you have, send them through the chat and they'll be relayed to the room. So any questions? Yes, Bob.
Yeah, I have a comment from Trish Nichols. She often keeps joining us
Right.
in the morning and such, but she wrote because she's been listening to the text study. And her comment to me was they described them as Elizabeth and Zechariah as being very old. So she went back and looked up what does age mean in that day. And what she came up with was 25 to 40 years old, which would put things in a little different perspective.
Yeah, so Trish Nichols looked up what does age mean, kind of what would constitute old in the first century when Zechariah and Elizabeth lived. And the answer ended up being something like 25 to 40, which for us, that sounds like childbearing age, right? Those are the families you want to get into the church, because then they populate the Sunday school. Yeah, if you ever read the novels by Bernard Cornwell, they're terrible and they're bloody. But it's always about these kind of savage wars going on when King Edward is trying to coalesce England into one country. And the guy writing it always says, "I'm so old," you know, and he looks back at all these things and tells these stories, but now I'm old. And then you find out he's like 50. And you think he's, Methuselah. So it's a little confusing. Now, as we read on in this story, we're going to encounter a couple other people who are old. And they're described as old. And one is Anna, and her age is given. She's 88. So that would fit a little more into the category of not quite old, but getting there, you know, for some of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome. So, and then Simeon, his age is not given, but he's described as being old and kind of at the point of being ready to die. So I don't know exactly how old is old. Clearly, the way Luke describes Elizabeth, she's beyond childbearing age, whatever that was for that time. And, you know, we could be talking about a time when a 13-year-old is betrothed and then wedded off. So yes, age categories are a very culturally specific sort of thing. Baron.
I was glad that you acknowledged that the Gabriel's, I'm going to say, punishment response seemed a little over the top, or what seemed like a not unreasonable question. And I know you worked really hard at that, but it still does.
Yeah, so we're hearing some appreciation that I acknowledge some trouble with the look of this text. That someone asked a question which, as you say, it does not seem to be unreasonable, and then is punished with a very harsh, what seemed to be a very harsh punishment. I mean, I don't want to chew on that too much. We have to because it's right there in the text, but I want to hold off on some of it because in 2 weeks, Mary's going to ask the question. And she gets away with it, scot-free. So that's the point at which we're gonna say, well, why does one question qualify as an angry retort from Gabriel? Like almost, how dare you? Do you know who I am? I was sent to you, buddy, right? And the other is like, oh, here's how it's gonna happen. God's gonna, and it's gonna, we'll do that more in 2 weeks. Yes, Jerome.
Bill Postman chat, is the phrase stand in the presence of God used anywhere else in the Old Testament?
In the Old Testament? Yeah. So I don't know, Bill. It's a little hard for me to track that down because when I do the translation, I can see that the adjective that's used there, stand before God. And you can kind of see how it plays out in the New Testament. And the one New Testament reference that I saw that really caught my eye was the one that I think I read in the video from Revelation that speaks about the 7 angels who stand before God. It's the very same language there. So we would think then that there's some part of the mythology, and I'm not using that term dismissively, it's the way we think about the world beyond our vision. Part of the mythology of the first century seems to be that there are these angels, particular angels that stand in the presence of God. And one would imagine that Gabriel is one of them. One might also imagine that Michael is one of them. That's another angel who gets named in the New Testament, kind of as a fierce warrior angel. So I don't really know the angelology of either the Old Testament or the New Testament. I think it's one of those theologies that developed over time and was probably strongly influenced by that intertestamental period. And Bill, I can't think off the top of my head where that phrase would be used in the Old Testament like that. So I'd have to give that a think. Yes, sir.
I'm reminded of one of my classmates who said, where you put commas makes a difference. And lo, another angel of the Lord appeared.
Oh, great. another angel, like, let's not just think there's one. Yeah, and then you're going to have a whole heavenly host. You know, that phrase, heavenly host, the word host means army. It's almost always translated an army. The Lord of hosts is a reference to having just an entire army there. And we think it's some dude running around with a little plate with hors d'oeuvres on it up in heaven. But the heavenly host is like this, a show of power is what it is. That's almost always the way the term host is used. Yes.
Well, I mentioned this to you yesterday. How many places does an angel or God confront somebody and they say, yea, verily, I'm on my way, amen? But
Right. So Les is asking, we're looking at Zechariah. He's given this promise, this kind of call, and he doesn't immediately lean into it. He questions it. So the question is, how often, when someone is either confronted by an angel of the Lord or the voice of the Lord or some other theophany of a call, how often do they answer, okay, let's do it? And I want to say the answer is probably two times that they say that, and the rest of the time they push back. So think about this. We're going to look in a minute at Abraham, how he responds to God's call. Think about Moses, who pushed back over and over again. They don't know me. Who do I say is sending me? How do I tout my authority? I stutter. I can't do this. There are all kinds of reasons why Moses didn't want to do it. Jeremiah's call. Jeremiah says, I'm just a boy. God said, don't despise you. Almost over and over again, whenever someone gets a call, particularly if it's to bear the word of God somewhere, it typically is met with some kind of resistance. Now, I'm overspeaking, but there are going to be two opportunities that we'll see of people who seem to have this kind of call of some sort and who say, okay. And it's Elizabeth and Mary. You'll notice that they share something in common that neither Abraham nor Moses nor Jeremiah had, and that is they're women. So part of what we want to do today is ask whether Elizabeth's response is faithful, or is that no? That's what we'll do next week. Sorry, we're going to see Elizabeth's response next week. And so I want you to be sure to read verses 21 through 25 for next week, and just ask yourself what's going on in Elizabeth's head, if you can imagine that, because her response is very odd, and it's left to us to try to figure out what it signifies. Okay, are there any other questions from the chat back there? No. Okay, well, let's get on then, if that's all right with you, because now I want to ask you this. Zechariah asks a question. The response from Gabriel seems very harsh. I have always been under the opinion that it takes a lot of faith to doubt. And that if you're in a religious system that won't allow questions, dares you to doubt, forbids you to doubt, it's a very flimsy structure that doesn't trust in either you as a thinking human being filled with God's own spirit, or God as a gracious God who bears with us. That's part of the reason I find the implications of this text somewhat troubling. And I don't want to just dismiss that outright and say, God doesn't care if you doubt. But I want to hold it that this means something in this text. But I'm wondering what it means in your experience. Do you feel free to ask questions? Even, look, I'm not talking about questions on the perimeter, of little things. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin or something? But, does God exist? Was this really a virgin birth? Why? Did this miracle really happen? I have a very good friend who talking about the miracle of the loaves and fishes. No matter how that story is told, his way of reading it was that when Jesus started taking that little bit that they had and sharing it, people who had a little bit tucked away in their bag decided they needed to pitch in a little bit, and someone else decided, next thing you know, we got plenty for everybody and even more. Now that's an interpretation that goes well beyond the text. But he just couldn't wrap his head around the miracle of breaking bread and fish and feeding 5,000 people. And he felt guilty that this beautiful rendition that he had come up with and that he had preached on occasion was rooted in his doubt in the authenticity of the original story. So that's what I'm asking you is, what do you do when you have doubt? Do you suppress it, shy away from it, lean into it, ignore it? How do you deal with that? I'm too busy waving my hands to drink. Yes, ma'am.
What you were just talking about, the man and his interpretation of Jesus feeding the flock.
Yeah.
If what he thinks happened, everybody taking something out and adding it, to me, that's a miracle. Because if you have that many people that all of a sudden realize, hey, I need to add so somebody else has something to eat, my way of thinking.
Okay.
That was a miracle.
So Shirley suggesting that if my friend's interpretation, she feels like if you hold that in itself is a miracle, that people's hearts were turned and they became sharers rather than hoarders in a time of scarcity. Which I think that's partly why I love his interpretation of that story. While I can acknowledge that that's not the way Mark tells the story. That's the way Mark tells the story. Jesus is breaking and just keeps on breaking. But that's one way of dealing with it is, miracles can either be magic things that break the laws of physics, or they can be phenomenal things that signify a change of heart and a change of practice among people, something like that.
I struggle with, I love to do questions, as you know. When is it just an intellectual exercise? When does it somehow touch faith or belief or something deeper?
Right.
And I struggle with that all the time.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Like Jerry, if you don't mind me saying this online. Hey, Jerry said it. Yeah, he struggles with this question. Like, when is the question that we have really kind of significant to our faith journey? And when is it just an intellectual exercise, a thing going on up here? Because it's always easy to question something. That's the easy part, right? And I want to get back to that. I want to see how others respond to that question first, but I really want to circle back to that because I think there are a couple of very important things for us to hold in mind when we practice what I would call faithful questioning. And I disagree with any teacher who ever said there's no bad question. I think some of them are horrible. Some of them are stupid. The questioners, I'm not calling you, and some of them are clearly meant to be distractions to avoid the fact that the kid didn't read the assignment. Look, I've been a teacher. I know how this works. Yes, Farrell.
Well, I appreciate you opening this up, and I struggle with it a lot. I think that because we're dealing with history, as well as interpretation, and I appreciate the fact that you open up those things for us. I tend to come back to, I'm going to say, the Bonhoeffer Communion of Saints, the the loving community that gets created out of faith experience. But a lot of it is very hard for me and I struggle with it. I agree.
Yeah, so, I mean, we're hearing that for many of us, I think, this is a real question, right? Because quite often faith seems identified as believing in certain propositions to be true. You got to believe that God created the world. In some churches, that God created the world in 6 days. You got to believe that that the people of Israel are specifically chosen. And for some people, that means something very particular about modern state of Israel. You got to believe that Jesus had a virgin birth. For some reason, that's a real kicker right there. When people ask me about the virgin birth, I like to say what Paul and Mark said about the virgin birth. Anything else, right? So, sorry. So there are a couple of things I want to just kind of offer you. And I'm no expert on this. I struggle exactly with everything you're saying. Number one, the word translated faith is pistuo in Greek. And another very healthy potential way of translating that word is trust. So think about trust more than faith. Then I think you're taking it out of here and putting it in here, right? If I trust in what you're saying, even if you don't get the facts right, I trust that what you're trying to convey to me is something that is really true to you. And I trust you as being a good egg about this, right? So trust just opens up the whole thing from the proposition to the intent, to the intended response, the relationship. Trust is a much more relational term than believe, right? So every time you see the word believe, just throw in trust and hold that for a minute. See how that works for you. I trust in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. And I trust in Jesus Christ, his only son. You see how even the Apostles' Creed kind of changes a little bit there. It's a good judgment call to translate pistuo as believe, but it's also a good judgment call to translate it as trust. And I think probably in Greek, it's got a more rounded meaning than just what's going on here. So I think we want to keep believe and trust in conversation. That's one thing. Second thing, it's easy to ask questions about virtually anything. It's easy to doubt anything. In theory, it's easy to doubt a lot of things, right? If you read Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, you can kind of doubt the existence of certain things as simply being what he calls a synthesis of a concept and a percept. And rather than something infinitely true. I'm not being fair to Kant, I'm very oversimplifying. But even the most dyed-in-the-wool Kantian, if you throw a baseball at their head, they're gonna duck. They're not gonna say, now that may be a baseball heading toward me. Or it might be just a perception that I'm connecting with the wrong concept, which means that, right? You know, so even sometimes when you can work something out in your head, your body is more wise than your brain sometimes, and your body will react because viscerally you're more invested in something. So I think it's probably good advice. Don't believe everything you think, right? Don't invest in your own opinions too heavily. There's a humility here that we should exercise even when doubting. And again, going back to the word trust, I trust that the biblical communities were a people inspired by God. They had a vision for how the world ought to be, that broke their heart over the way they saw how the world is at times, and which opened up an avenue for how God's people ought to act. And I think that's the whole kind of covenantal faith that they are trying to communicate through the scriptures. And so I don't trust that they understood physics. And I don't trust that they understood the origins of the world. And I'm relatively sure some of them really thought the world was created in 6 days. I'm relatively sure some of them were like, I don't know how the world was created. This is a song of praise to show that every part of creation is part of God's loving creativity. I think they're a lot more sophisticated and open-minded than we think. You know, within the first 2 chapters of Genesis, you have 2 very different creation stories with 2 different names for God, 2 different ways by which God creates. One, God speaks, things come into existence. The other, God gets down and makes little clay figures and they come to life. These are 2 very different ways of thinking about the way God is involved. The early biblical communities knew that we had 4 different gospels and they tell the stories differently. They're not stupid, right? They didn't not realize that the 4 different resurrection stories had 4 different descriptions of who showed up at the tomb. They did realize that. They gave it to you like that, fully realizing that. I'm talking about the early church, not the biblical writers, but the church that kind of culled together the books that we call our New Testament. They knew there were differences there, and they handed that on to us as the Word of God. So ask yourself this question: Are they demanding that there's only one way of telling this story, that one thing has to be true, or did they actually believe that there are numerous ways of telling the wonderful story, each of which is true in its own way? And if they're like that, why can't we read it like that? You know, I think the best guide for reading the scriptures is to try to read it the way it's written. And notice that I think these were well-intended, self-consciously humans trying to speak about things that lie beyond human comprehension, but are nonetheless wonderful and charm life in a way that has to be told and inspired in their own living and sharing that through these writers. So,
What a good sermon you just gave.
thank you. I am going to pass that hat around and we'll take a collection. Now, why do I say that? Because it's too easy to just sit around and poke holes in all the stories. And this drives me crazy. People who never have bothered to read the story from beginning to end just kind of dismiss it because they know better. They lack the humility that we talked about. They lack the trust of the people communicating. Doesn't mean you have to believe everything the way it comes across, but there's an honorable way of doubting and of asking questions. And in some respects, I feel like part of what Gabriel is responding to, it seems like, if I can interject human feelings onto an angel, which I don't know what the heck these things are, Gabriel seems offended that, you know, Gabriel knows he's an angel and he stands in the presence of God. He was specifically asked by God to specifically go to this guy and tell him the specific good news, not just news. And the first thing the guy does is question, how will I know this to be true? Gabriel seems personally offended. I mean, really kind of. And I don't know if it's God's going to make Zechariah mute or if angels have that capacity. But Zechariah comes out dumbfounded. Okay. Yeah,
Just a quick observation.
Yeah.
I thought it was very good of Zechariah. First, somebody appears where they shouldn't be, and he's afraid. He's told not to be afraid, so he's not afraid, and he's told he's gonna have a son, and he says, no, I'm old, and then he says, what do you know about this?
right.
I think he pretty, drew a spine instantly, and had the temerity to ask a question.
All right. This is great. This is great. Right. So when the angel first appeared, Jerome is saying when the angel first appeared, every time the angels appear, they must scare the bejesus out of people, because the first thing they have to say is, don't run away, don't be afraid, do not fear. And that's phobia. That's that Greek word. Don't be full of fear. So the first thing Gabriel says to Zechariah is, don't be afraid. And so, as Jerome says, Zechariah grows a spine and asks a question. And suddenly he looks like he's being punished for it. And I don't say that to cast doubt that it's harsh. He's being punished for it. It almost feels like he's being unafraid, like Gabriel told him. So I do want to draw your attention to this. You remember that the references to Abraham and Sarah are implied every time we hear that Zechariah is old and Elizabeth is past childbearing age and has been barren. Okay, Sarah has always been kind of the archetype in the scriptures of women who have had to bear the shame of being barren. I don't think there's inherent shame in not having children, but in this time and culture, women who did not give their husbands a child, right? So we're talking about a very different cultural setting, but they bore a lot of shame as a result of that. And that's how Abraham and Sarah are described. And that factors into the origin story of the people of Israel. So when you read the book of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, you can call prehistory. Prehistory, like we use the term prehistoric. That term doesn't make sense if you think history refers to everything in the past, because prehistoric means before things in the past. No, history doesn't refer to everything in the past. History refers to recorded past. When you can put a place, maybe a date, maybe a name. But the things that happened before that, like dinosaurs and stuff, at most we're finding skeletal remains that tell us things. So we refer to that as prehistoric. But when you have humans appear, fully humanoid, and they start to write, when they start to develop civilization and so forth, that's what we call history. I don't know if you've noticed that in our language. The fact that we have something called prehistoric means that we got a cutoff date. I would argue that we could think of chapters 1 through 11 as prehistoric, because it's really hard to figure out where in the world this stuff takes place. The Garden of Eden, if you try to follow the rivers where the Garden of Eden is, they don't really come together at any point. Noah's Ark, good luck finding that. Whatever. There does seem to have been this antediluvian flood at one point that shaped terrain and so forth. The Tower of Babel, we don't know where that was. So all of those things those are the main stories in chapters 1 through 11. And they're about a people, sort of, but it's not really a time, place, location. It really comes together in chapter 12 of Genesis. This is where the story of the people of Israel begins, not just the story of creation in general, okay? And it begins with this encounter, verses 1 through 3. This is the beginning of that story. Lamar and I have ongoing conversation whether I should call it the beginning of the covenant or the beginning of the promise. I won't tell you who's on what side. But it starts with this promise for sure.
So who's winning?
He wins. I concede defeat every time we differ on something. I just do it like a brat when I'm still thinking I'm right. Genesis 12, 1-3. Now the Lord said to Abram, this is before his name is changed, Abram, go from your country, wherever the heck that is, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you will all the families of the earth be blessed. There it is, right there. And the very next verse begins, so Abram went. And he ended up in a land that we start to identify as the land of the people of Israel. Okay, that's the beginning of it right there. He says to Abram, I will make you a great nation. Now, you're talking to a guy who I think at this point is maybe 75-ish years old. Ages are a real hard thing to track in these Old Testament stories. I mean, you got people who live to be 900. But Abraham and Sarah have kind of gone beyond the childbearing years. Okay, this promise comes to Abraham. A couple other things happen along the way. Abraham and Lot, his nephew, and so forth. In chapter 15, the promise is renewed. So it happens 3 different times. The second is in chapter 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, here's a question. O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. That's his servant. So if he dies childless, his servant will take over, I suppose, the chief steward. And Abram said, you have given me no offspring. So a slave born in my house is to be my heir. Now, you would expect that the Lord would say, I'm God, and I just gave you good news. So you will not speak until this baby's born. If you think that the story of Zechariah is the model, that's what we might expect. But indeed, here's what happened. But the word of the Lord came to him, that man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. Abraham's going to have a son. He brought him outside and said, look toward the heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And then he said to him, so shall your descendants be. Verse 6. And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. That may be the most important verse in the book of Genesis. Okay? You'll hear it again in the New Testament. Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him. So Abraham asked a question, and it's a reasonable question. I'm old. I'm not having kids. I've got a slave in my household who was born here, and according to whatever customs were in place at that time, when he dies, everything's going to be owned by that slave. And God said, no, your own son will be there. And Abraham believed. So far. Now, let's see what happens in the next chapter. That's chapter 15. Okay. Go back and read it, because then Abraham makes an offering and so forth. It's rather interesting. In chapter 16, that's when Sarah gives her slave Hagar to Abram, to have a child through him. Chapter 16 begins, now Sarah, which is now spelled S-A-R-A-I, just FYI. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said to Abram, you see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. Okay, this is probably not an uncommon practice for wealthier, older, barren women, is to say, here's a slave, have a baby, I'll take it, it'll be my baby. I guess Sarah seems to say it as if this is obvious. And look at the next verse. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. This was the guy that just in the last chapter believed the Lord, right? So he took Hagar, and they had a child named Ishmael, which is the beginning of many problems in this storyline. Okay, Hagar has a child, Ishmael, and she begins, as the story says, to despise Sarah. I don't know exactly what that means, but Sarah doesn't like it, and now she wants to get rid of Hagar and the child. And Abram listens to the voice of Sarah and gets rid of Hagar and the child. Hagar and the child. It's a weird story. 1 minute, Isaac sounds like he's maybe 12, 13. The next minute, it sounds like a baby. And God meets Hagar and Ishmael in the desert where they are left to die and makes a covenant with them. So there are more than one covenant with God going on in this book of Genesis. Okay, just FYI. And they go back. Okay, so that was chapter 6. So you had the promise initially in chapter 12. You had the promise renewed in chapter 15 with a little pushback saying, oh no, this is going to be your child. Chapter 16, Sarah comes up with a clever way of enabling God's promise to be true through Hagar. Chapter 17, what happens there? Well, a couple of things. First of all, God institutes circumcision as a sign of Abraham's people. Okay, that will be a sign of their covenant. Secondly, God changes the name from Abram to Abraham, and from Sarah with an I to Sarah with an H. Biblical commentators will tell you what the difference is in the meaning of those names. I'm thinking they're working really hard to find something significant to tell us there. I have only the smallest measure of confidence in that. But look what happened in verse 17. All right, starting in verse 15. God said to Abraham, as for Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her Sarah with an I, but Sarah with an H shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she will give rise to nations. Kings of people shall come from her. And then Abraham, here's his response. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said, can a child be born to a man who's 100 years old? Can Sarah, who's 90 years old, bear a child? Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live in your son. Abraham basically saying to God, can't happen. I got a boy over here. Let him be the one. This is the one, I told you the most memorable verse Abraham believed, and it was reckoned unto him as righteousness. He's not believing so much right now. And God said, no, but your wife Sarah shall bear you a son, and you shall call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. And he said, as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will bless him too. Okay. So there you go. So that's the third disclosure to Abraham. And let me ask you, did he just believe? Is he full of faith? Was his question, was his pushback, was his falling on his face, laughing at what God said, any less admirable than, or any less of an offense than what Zechariah did, right? But when you get to the New Testament, in Romans chapter 4, I want you to hear how Paul summarizes this Abraham story. Romans chapter 4 and 5 are fabulous chapters in a very dense and difficult book. They're fabulous chapters because Paul continually uses the phrase much more surely. Much more surely. It's very redundant. It's redundant in Greek, it's redundant in English. And he talked about, if it's obvious, more or less, this is my summation. If it's obvious that the world is sinful and broken, much more surely is it obvious that God will save the world. That's how he uses that term. And he's talked about Abraham. And he goes back to that phrase, Abraham believed. And it was reckoned unto him as righteous. This is before Abraham was circumcised. This is years before the law. Okay, so righteousness happens by faith, by believing, trusting in God, not by circumcision and not by following the law. That's why Paul is banking on the story of Abraham. And Abraham's the father of those who practice circumcision and the law. So his argument is going to be that in Abraham's faith, you've got a faith for those who are outside of the law, because Abraham believed before the law existed, before circumcision existed. So Abraham's the father of faith for those who are not circumcised. And Abraham's the father of faith for those who are circumcised, because he went on to be circumcised and his children and practice that and to get the law. So he looked at Abraham as, because before circumcision, the law, and all of those distinctions were made, Abraham believed. And that's what was righteous. That there's a way of thinking about faith that is effective for Jews who follow the law, and faith is effective for Gentiles who don't. It's a brilliant, brilliant argument based on the timing of that verse in Genesis 15:6. So he says, what then are we to say was gained by Abraham, our ancestor, according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he would have something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God. What's another way of saying that? Abraham trusted God. And it was reckoned, I love that word. I'm sorry that I always sound like a southerner whenever I use it. It was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, to one who works, wages are not reckoned as a gift, but as something due. Anyway, this is where he starts to make his argument that this righteousness is for those who live according to the law and those who live apart from the law. That faith, trust comes first. The brilliant argument. And what is Paul doing? He's willing to say that in the whole, Abraham trusted God. That's the way Paul speaks about Abraham, someone who trusted God. But you heard, and I heard, that along the way, Abraham asked questions. He offered plan B, or at least accepted Sarah's offer of plan B, which was Ishmael. He laughed, fell on his face and laughed. We often make a lot of hay about the fact that Sarah will laugh later when told that she's going to have a baby, but Abraham laughed first. So apparently asking questions, trying to devise plan B to help God along because you think God can't do it, and laughing about it is not antithetical to trust. An interesting journey, isn't it? Trusting or believing doesn't always mean every moment you're fully convinced. I think that's, I think the fact that Luke keeps pointing back to the story of Abraham really invites us to just kind of walk through what it looks like in life, to live a life that is fully summarized one day as having trusted in God's promises. But along the way, there are all kinds of questions and all kinds of journeys. Okay, that is more or less what I planned to talk about today. We've still got about 4 or 5 minutes. Anybody have any? Yes, Jeremy.
Sorry.
Jeremy.
I rather easily try to be the Gentiles someplace out there that Luke is writing for.
Okay.
I have trouble giving a crap about all that old Jewish stuff. I
Right,
don't particularly like Jews. They're, or not Jews, let's call them Israelites at the time. It's a
Right.
charming little village.
Right.
Place that I lorded over. And so why is he writing all this to me?
right. Great question. And I'm not going to give you the answer. I'm going to give you my take on what perhaps the answer may be, if I'm not wrong. I don't have a lot of confidence in this thing. Okay. I want to remember two things going on. Okay. I think, and this conversation came up last night during Brew Theology. We think that Luke is writing largely for a non-Jewish audience. Typically, it's understood that Matthew is writing for a Jewish audience. Luke seems not to be writing for a Jewish audience. And so why all the attention to Jews? And why all the surreptitious references to Abraham and Sarah, with the assumption that you know their story well enough for those references to make the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth more meaningful? Okay, so let's remember two things. Yes, I think Luke is largely writing for a Gentile audience, perhaps for a mixed Jewish Gentile audience. If you follow the story of Acts, it seems like most of the Christian communities that even are arising in Gentile areas, there seem to be some Jewish presence there from different diasporas. So let's say it's a mixed Jewish Gentile audience, but he's not writing to people in Jerusalem. He's writing to people like in Rome, Galatia, places like that. So it wouldn't make sense for Luke to assume that when he makes a parallel reference to Abraham and Sarah, that the reader would know exactly what he's talking about. You're right. That doesn't make sense at the level of the final didactic writing. But there are two levels of storytelling going on here. Remember that I think, this is where I'm on thin ice. I think when telling the story of John the Baptizer, Luke is drawing from John's disciples, which was a very Jewish group who knew their scriptures. They're the ones who cultivated this story. They're the ones for whom these surreptitious references to Abraham and Sarah give the story thickness and meaning and backstory. And I think Luke is honoring their storytelling by presenting their story of John the Baptizer. Then he'll present the story of Jesus, which is not their story, and it'll be a little bit different. And then he'll weave the two together. So I think that the focus on Jewish history is in the source rather than the redaction. Okay, those are two different levels of biblical criticism. One is you go, who's the source group? And the second level is who's the person taking all those sources and editing them together. That's what the word redaction means. You edit them together into one narrative. So I think John the Baptist people were very invested in the Old Testament story. That gave John's birth so much more meaning. But you're probably right. Much of Luke's audience probably read these verses the way you and I have read them for years. Oh, that's kind of interesting. Without any immediate sense of the backstory of Abraham and Sarah. And that's okay. It communicates. We've gotten along just fine with the story for many years. But I think in the source, it was something deeper. That makes sense? Yeah, cool, thanks.
Years ago, when I was working with medical students, I was reminded of one that sometimes you're dealing with a history in a history.
Right.
And my admonishment to them would find out about that larger history so you understand this history.
Right. So Les is pointing out that at times he's counseled people to remember that sometimes we're dealing with a history within a history. And I think for our conversation, we're looking at source and final writing as two different moments. All we have is a final writing. But it seems evident that Luke is honoring the source in the way he's writing this text. Okay, I'm seeing 10:31, and we started a little bit late, so we end a little bit late. That's how we do. That's all we have time for today then. I'm gonna ask Sue Ann to go ahead and stop the recording.